to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Daniel Bryant, News Manager at InfoQ and Product Architect at DataWire, and I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Tracy Miranda, Director of Open Source Community at CloudBees and Board Chair at the Continuous Delivery Foundation. I've been lucky enough to have known Tracy for many years now, and last year she ran a superb track at KubeCon London that focused on innovations within the continuous delivery space. Since then, she has gone on to become an influential member in the relatively new Continuous Delivery Foundation, or CDF. One of my goals in this podcast was to learn more about this foundation. I was also keen to explore the list of currently hosted projects within the CDF and get Tracy's thoughts around the need for open standards within the continuous delivery space. As we've heard in other recent InfoQ podcasts from Brian Lyles and Gareth Rushgrove, there is definitely a potential need for better abstractions, interoperability, and componentization within continuous integration and continuous delivery. I'm also becoming increasingly interested in topics such as progressive delivery, championed by James Governor and the RedMonk team, and I'm also curious around things like software supply chain management. These are not necessarily new topics, but they are getting more and more interest now as many of us are thinking about things like security, reliability, and availability within all aspects of our software systems. And so I was definitely keen to pick Tracy's brains around this. Hello, Tracy, and welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for having me.
Could you briefly introduce yourself, please, and share a bit about your background?
I'm the Director of Open Source at CloudBees and also on the governing board for the Continuous Delivery Foundation. And so I've come into the CI/CD space recently, but my background is actually in electronics, developer tools, but the overarching theme has always been open source.
Awesome. That leads perfectly onto my next question. How important do you think open source is to the community at large?
I think it's critical. I think it's great to see that these days that's generally acknowledged. Everybody understands and gets open source in a way that maybe they didn't 10 or more years ago, but it makes all the difference to innovation, building communities around technology, and just, pushing things forward.
So I wanted today to pick your brains around the Continuous Delivery Foundation. Actually, you and I were chatting at the Open Core Summit last year, and I've definitely heard many good things from you in the past as well. So you're on the governing board at the Continuous Delivery Foundation. If I ask you about getting an elevator pitch for this, what would you tell me?
So the Continuous Delivery Foundation is an open source foundation that was set up to be like a vendor neutral place to drive the future of continuous delivery. So that's it in a nutshell. And I'm more than happy to go into kind of all the different things that covers in reality.
Yeah, so I'm definitely keen to cover some of the specific projects later, but it'd be nice to kind of get almost like a vision statement kind of thing. I guess that's where I was kind of looking for, because a lot of folks see these foundations and they're not sure, is it just tech, is it specs, is it implementations, is it TOC? There's a whole mix of things there, isn't there?
Yeah, so the way I see it, the main remit of the Continuous Delivery Foundation is to advance continuous delivery adoption. And where a foundation comes in is to take care of the things that might be kind of neglected if you just had individual products or individual open source communities pursuing things from a narrow field of view. So the Continuous Delivery Foundation is well set up to cover kind of cross-cutting concerns, things like security across the industry, interoperability across tools, promoting standards or de facto standards, and even things like diversity, making sure as an industry as a whole, we tackle problems that would be difficult for any sort of one smaller group to deal with.
Interesting. I'm guessing it can be challenging, though, getting all the folks involved to agree sometimes.
Yes, I think herding cats is often the phrase that people use with open source foundations. But yeah, part of the challenge is also the fun of it.
I hear you. I totally hear you. So I'm sure you get this question all the time, and I've definitely seen some interesting stuff on Twitter. But could you sort of briefly outline the similarities and differences between the CDF and the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation?
Yes, and I think you're putting it kindly there, but this is something that comes up for us all the time. So we like to think of the CNCF as effectively kind of a sibling foundation. The reality is, when we were looking to set up the CDF, we looked at the CNCF and that whole model of how it's set up and the success it's had in evangelizing technology and changing the industry is kind of what we're looking at. The difference is, so while CNCF is focused on cloud native technologies, the CDF has a different scope. So we're focused on delivering software, all the processes that go up into that. And also, it's not just cloud native, we talk about continuous delivery. It could be for embedded platforms, the whole IoT space. It could be mobile platforms. So the scope of continuous delivery and software delivery in general is just, overarching. In that way, that's another difference we see between CDF and CNCF.
Super. That's definitely very helpful. I wanted to dive into some of the projects now a little bit, if that's okay. Assuming some listeners, and myself included probably, before I started looking into it, may not know what projects are included in the Continuous Delivery Foundation. The first two that jumped out to me as a long-time Java developer was Jenkins and Jenkins X. Now, I've used Jenkins for years. I've been looking at Jenkins X quite a bit. Actually, one of your colleagues, Oscar Medina, got to give a shout out to Oscar, mentioned to me recently that Jenkins X is very different to the original Jenkins. So what could you kind of give a bit of a 101 to folks on the differences between Jenkins and Jenkins X and where they're positioned?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is something we get asked all the time because, they say software naming is hard. And this is kind of, I think, the prime example of it. So Jenkins, as everybody knows, is, the original platform for like automation and CI and to some extent CD. But Jenkins X is just CI/CD reimagined. So we talk about how the Jenkins community could see there were some limitations with this platform, which was developed, 15 years ago. And with Jenkins X, it was a chance to take a fresh approach to that, to say, if we were looking to do the same thing, how would we start from scratch? And how would we build on Kubernetes, which has become, kind of the base platform now? So Jenkins X completely reimagined CI/CD, building on Kubernetes. And when it comes to the naming, I like to think it's almost like VS Code to Visual Studio. So you have sort of VS Code is the new kind of modern IDE, and Visual Studio is what people are used to and traditionally use, but actually there's no similarity in code base. And I think that's one of the things people don't see, that Jenkins X is completely written in Go for the large part. There's no Java in there, but it orchestrates a whole bunch of tools underneath it, which could include Jenkins, Kubernetes, Tekton, all sorts of things are under there. That you've got Helm, you've got Vault.
I know I bumped into Jenkins X, I think, from James Strachan talking about it, and he was talking a lot about the ideas in Nicole Forsgren's book, Accelerate, kind of being captured. They believe it's 4 metrics that correlate with high-performing organizations, and Jenkins X is kind of focused on enabling that kind of change, I guess, but from a technological point of view.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think they have looked very specifically at, I think they call them capabilities in the Accelerate book. And, we acknowledge there's not everything can be fixed by tools, but there are certain things that tools drive. And so some of the capabilities include like loosely coupled architectures, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and there's a lot more we can do for automating these or connecting them up to Git in a very kind of connected way. This whole concept of GitOps, that's all about true automation. And that's what Jenkins X is really looking to do. And that then ties in directly with those 4 metrics spelled out very well in the Accelerate book.
So I've used Spinnaker a little bit in a couple of projects, but quite a while ago. And I remember when it originally, I believe, came out of Netflix and Google. I think it's evolved quite a bit since I last used it. Why would folks use Spinnaker these days?
So Spinnaker, we see a lot of folks really interested in it. Spinnaker comes very directly from the continuous delivery side of things, and it was one of the pioneering platforms to really simplify some of those concepts, different types of deployments. And I think we talk a lot about blue-green deployments today, or red-black in Spinnaker, and it just made things very easy for people to do in that way.
What's the pitch for Tekton? Because that's kind of like continuous delivery with Kubernetes. I'm guessing there's some overlap with Jenkins X there.
Absolutely. So Tekton, the folks there are looking at kind of, again, building on Kubernetes, but really establishing some of the basic building blocks you have behind CI/CD. And this is a lot building around Kubernetes CRDs, but setting those up in a way that you can use them for CI/CD. Like one of the sayings the Tekton team have is that Tekton is the plumbing and Jenkins X is the porcelain. So Tekton is this collection. I know.
Nice.
Which then, of course, prompts everybody to go, well, what are we saying about delivery and toilet metaphors? But so I think Tekton provides all these really standardized blocks, and it allows you to build platforms on top of it. So you can have kind of Tekton CI, but Jenkins X uses Tekton as the pipeline engine underneath it as a pure cloud native. You can ramp it up. You can scale to whatever size you want. And that's one of the ways you can do real, proper cloud native CI/CD.
Super. So one more technology I wanted to cover, and then we'll sort of perhaps pull out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. But I bumped into Screwdriver.cd, and I'd not actually heard of that, I'll confess, until I went onto the website and started a look around. I believe it's a sort of incubating project or not a graduated project yet. But could you explain to listeners what the sort of value prop of Screwdriver.cd is, please?
So this one is a newer project. I think it's a kind of more end-to-end application, and it sort of came out of the folks at Yahoo and Verizon. And one of the things in CDF is that we're looking to encourage folks who kind of buy into the ethos of interoperability. And I think that's one of the places where the Screwdriver team sort of came in and sort of said, okay, we've done these things, but we want to be part of the community. We want to leverage what other people are doing. So yeah, we're interested to kind of work together with them and have them be part of that.
I'm guessing a big value of the CDF is that you can provide this platform to allow folks to interoperate not only on a technical level, but also on a kind of terminology level as well.
Yes, exactly. And for me, on a personal level, I came into CI/CD a couple of years ago, and frankly, it was a bit of a nightmare when you talk to people and you realize it doesn't even happen immediately, but after a while you realize you've been talking at cross purposes about, what a job is or what a stage is. And so by virtue of having this community where we then put all these people developing different tools together, it was obvious that this is a problem. We need to have a reference kind of way of talking about it, or making it clear that we're not saying we're using the same word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So that's been really exciting because we have an interoperability special interest group, and they've come up with exactly what you described, the Rosetta Stone for terms for CI/CD. And we started with the terms around a pipeline. So we've already got like almost a dozen terms, and there's this really interesting table where you've got, this is what it is in GitHub Actions. This is what it is in Jenkins. This is what it is in Tekton. And you only have to sort of look at that table and you can see, okay, this is where we all agree as an industry. This is where a step, a job, and a task are all different. And so this is pretty exciting, and I'm looking forward to how it evolves. So first of all, let's agree there's a problem. Second, how do we solve that? And that's going to be pretty interesting to follow.
I wanted to pull out to a little bit higher level now. One thing that I think I learned from Martin Fowler and folks like that was separating deployment and release. Yeah, and it took me a while to get there. Definitely in my Java days, we used to just deploy the monolith, and that was effectively the release at the same time. Now, with kind of loosely bounded microservice-based systems or service-oriented systems, we can deploy and then use things like API gateways or service mesh to release separately. What's the CDF's or your thoughts, I guess, on that within the CDF? Is CDF interested in continuous delivery, deployment, and release?
Yes, I think, again, going back to the naming things, the term continuous delivery, I think, has very specific connotations, particularly in certain circles. It's a very specific defined thing, which is as opposed to continuous deployment or, release. I think I like to take a bigger picture view. Probably more accurately, it should be the software delivery foundation. So we talk about in the mission of CDF that we're focused on the software delivery lifecycle. So pretty much everything it takes to ship the software and get it to users in an effective and safe way.
I think you and I are fans as well of James McGovern's work, Red Monk. He talks all about progressive delivery. He's got some fantastic tweets, fantastic blog posts. Is progressive delivery something that the CDF would be interested in too?
Absolutely. And I was privileged enough to head up a track at QCon in the UK last year. And we had James Governor come along, and it was almost one of the first times in a big audience that he was talking about the progressive delivery concepts. And you could see it was instantly resonating with folks, and they were almost jumping to, okay, this totally sets out a concept that we've sort of known, but we haven't known how to articulate. And then it tells us, okay, we want this feedback, and we want to, have these concept of blast radius. So I think that is definitely an area of interest. And in the CDF's self-appointed role of helping people adopt continuous delivery and making it easier for them to do, I think that will very much be in its future.
One other thing I was curious to ask about is the notion of observability. Because when I've chatted to James, when I've been reading James's stuff, he's talking about continuous delivery, but sort of giving that good feedback. So you need observability both from an app level and a platform level to understand what your changes are doing. And then you can get the feedback and hopefully make it better. So is observability, again, something the CDF would be interested in?
I dare say so. I would say I think some of the conversations around observability are happening in other places at the moment. So it's not necessarily something we'd get to immediately, but maybe, as we go down that path of progressive delivery. So probably something we're keeping tabs on, but I think there's other places as well doing a lot of that. Some of the areas we do want to cover tend to be kind of less new, kind of the areas that there's a lot of buzz around, some of the things like progressive delivery and observability, but we're also keen to just cover the basics. Like I think testing is going to be an area I'd love us to focus on, which is, pretty boring.
Super important.
Doesn't get the coverage as some of these newer terms. We need a new term for it. So, no, I didn't just say that. But yeah, I think seeing what we can do in spaces like that is going to be super important.
I guess that's one of the things I learned I did some stuff on the Java community process. And a lot of the benefits of foundations and community processes is you're actually, like you're saying, you're standardizing the boring stuff. You're standardizing stuff that is super important, but we haven't all perhaps agreed on it or set it in stone.
Yes. And, for me, if I had to kind of imagine some sort of magical thing CDF could do, it would almost be like standardizing some things around testing. Like, why don't we have standardized metadata for how we report testing around continuous delivery pipelines? Could we take something like JUnit, which is de facto standard, and build on that and then say, hey, everybody, let's all use the metadata in this way. Let's agree to do that, whether you're Jenkins X or Spinnaker or whoever, and then all of a sudden downstream consumption of the tests, all the things we could build on top of that, how we layer on observability, all becomes so much simpler and it becomes just more powerful.
Like that message of interoperability, you talked about several times already, Tracy, and off mic, and we were talking about it. It's such a powerful thing, the interoperability. If you can get that abstraction and the interface correct, I think it unlocks a lot of other innovation.
Yes, for sure. And I've seen it in other industries. Like my favorite story is something like NumPy, which before it came along, there were 3 or 4 different types of things all doing pretty much the same thing. And then, as soon as I think it was Travis Oliphant went and standardized everything on NumPy, look at where the world is now with all kind of machine learning and data processing. And yeah, for me, that's kind of the ultimate direction we want to head.
Other than the things we've talked about there, is there any other projects coming down the pipeline with the CDF? Or if folks are listening and thinking about, what kind of projects would they be submitting? Any sort of guidance for us there?
We'd love to encourage folks to submit their projects. I think we've been doing a lot of bootstrapping, a lot of conversations in the technical oversight committee about different directions. So folks can propose projects to the talk. I think they've got a few coming down the pipeline, but I'm actually not seeing what's coming out lately. There's a couple of areas, like if they were some particular ones, I'd love to see something on resiliency engineering potentially as well. So anything in kind of delivering software we'd be interested in.
Before moving on to some of the platform and future stuff, if folks are looking to get involved with the CDF, what's the best way for sort of individuals or organizations to contribute?
I think starting off at the website, cd.foundation, that's got links to lots of the different sort of initiatives we have going on. And then from there, you can sort of find your way to the Slack channel or just to a specific working group. Like we've got the interoperability one, we've got the machine learning one, so MLOps, or just some of the more general kind of communities.
What's your opinion on the state of developer tooling at the moment? And obviously there's the cloud space and there's many other spaces. I'm more probably interested in this respect from the cloud area. I know you've done a bunch of work kind of in this space. Do we need to get better at DevX, UX? What's your thoughts there?
Not to be harsh, but I'm pretty glad I am not a new developer coming in to the software industry at this point, because I have no idea how someone doing that is supposed to make heads or tails of what all the different choices are and how to get started. So it is kind of a bit of a fragmented nightmare. And we need to kind of get better as an industry at solving that.
Yeah, you think that's the best way of sort of all of us trying to come together? Because right now I've seen the CNCF have put together their landscape, for example. And at the start that was super helpful, but now it's got so big that even me as like trying to use the landscape, I'm like, it's like an eye chart. Yeah, and I think they know that, of course. I'm not trying to be negative on them. It's genuinely hard, yeah, to make it easy for developers.
Absolutely. And software development has become so complex. So it's tricky to try to say, okay, what are the ways we could fix things? Like, I'm personally a fan of more opinionated kind of information, which, to a certain extent gets me in trouble as well, because I will say things like, why can't we have one right way of doing specific things? Just like Git is kind of a given for version control. If you're coming in today, if you don't know that you have special requirements, or you just don't know, everybody will just say, start with Git. Don't even think about it. Just start with Git. If that doesn't work for you, then you can switch to something else. But we don't have that in most other areas. Kubernetes is consolidating things, so at least that's solving that. But a lot of other areas, there's so much choice and there's so much noise. And then sometimes there's people in the space who make it worse, trying to piggyback on terms or piggyback on platforms, so they add to the noise. And that's where it gets just really horrendous, because people stop trusting. They just don't know how to pick things and who to trust.
If we now sort of step back a little bit, you and I were talking off mic about sort of the future of continuous delivery, the future of platforms. I'd love to get your thoughts on where this is going, perhaps from a high level, and then we can dive a bit deeper as we go along.
I think at a high level, and again, this ties to what the Continuous Delivery Foundation can help drive, I think it's time for us to really standardize the pipeline layer of CI/CD. The pipeline is ready to be commoditized. And if we can do that, we can move on just to higher level things. And there's a couple of concepts coming out. If you start looking at, okay, let's say you commoditize the pipeline and you start moving up the stack, where does that lead to? And we have these couple of terms, like certainly CloudBees and a few others are looking at, and it's around software delivery management. How do you see software as something, like a factory that's producing software? How do you manage it? And then the other half of that is software delivery automation. How do you automate it? How do you make all the blocks work together? How do you put machine learning around that so you don't necessarily need humans in the loop for some of it? So the software delivery management and software delivery automation, I think, is where we're headed as an industry. So just that high level people managing software like you would a factory, and all the efforts we've had around factories and the processes and Kanban and all that kind of thing, we're now having that same set of events play out for software delivery.
Very interesting. As you were discussing that, Tracy, I was thinking about something I heard many years ago, but it only frequently pops up now, is the notion of a software supply chain. And I'm guessing like things like the CDF is like super in the right place for things like security and due diligence and this kind of stuff. I'm guessing that might be of interest in the future as well.
Yes, I think software supply chain, I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about that. I think there's going to be some pretty big efforts in the space. I think not just from CDF, but I think it's generally an area everybody wants to come together to solve and make better.
So if we're wrapping up now, Tracy, what would be your core message for folks looking to get into open source work and open source community?
I think we've covered a lot of it, but in general, as I say, I'm a big open source advocate. I think the models around the foundation really work well to promote these. So I'd encourage people to get involved, to come get stuck in with the CDF, because, we sort of talk about in open source, the communities, the capacity. So we're really unlimited with the kind of things we can do as long as we come together and we're sort of focused on this vision. It's pretty powerful and it feels good to be part of. And, I think we're at a time in the world where the world is changing so much, and we're seeing that software delivery and automation is just going to be key to every industry, really. And I think this is our one chance to get that right. And open source and open source communities are going to be the way that we do that. So yeah, get involved, folks.
Well said, Tracy. Well said. If folks want to follow you online, what's the best way?
Twitter, always happy to connect with people there. So at Tracy Miranda on Twitter, and please feel free to reach out.
Super. Thanks for your time today, Tracy.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me, Daniel.